The next lecture will be about hormonal changes that occur during pregnancy, and also we're going to talk a little bit about how the placenta develops as an organ that's going to support the developing embryo and fetus while it's located inside the womb. I do want to point out when I was creating the PowerPoint for the reproductive system, I somehow managed to wind up with two Lecture 18s, and so now those have been designated Lecture 18A and Lecture 18B. All right, first of all, we have a very important hormone that is produced very soon after fertilization, conception occurs, and that is human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. Very important protein. Chorionic is referring to the chorion, and that's the outermost structure that develops and surrounds the early developing embryo. Gonadotropin, remember, tropins are hormones that affect other endocrine glands, and gonado is referring to gonad. So that's letting us know this hormone is going to impact the ovaries in the female. Okay, and what structure makes this? So the trophoblast cells, remember, by about 6-7 days after conception, the very early embryo has developed into a structure called the blastocyst, and there you have your inner cell mass. Those cells are going to develop into the embryo itself, the new tiny human, and also some of the supporting structures. And then you have this outer covering here. Remember, this is a hollow ball of cells that we have here. The outer covering is called the trophoblast. The cells there are trophoblast cells. And so they produce HCG beginning fairly soon after fertilization. And later the chorion is going to produce this hormone, and that's where the name human chorionic gonadotropin comes from. Very important hormone. This is also the hormone that is detected by pregnancy tests. So when you take a home pregnancy test and you're looking for that little plus sign or color change or whatever it is, that test is actually detecting HCG. HCG gets into the mother's bloodstream. It's a hormone, so it's going to travel in the blood. We've just learned about how the kidneys filter the blood, so HCG is also going to wind up in the filtrate in the kidneys, and of course that develops into the urine that's excreted from the body. So that's how HCG winds up in the mother's urine. Now what this hormone does, so we said it acts on the ovaries. More specifically, it acts on the corpus luteum. So if you remember the corpus luteum in the ovaries, or in an ovary, you should only have one corpus luteum during a typical ovarian uterine cycle. The corpus luteum is cranking out progesterone and estrogen, and that's needed to develop the endometrial lining properly and to maintain it along the inside of the uterus. And as we talked about earlier, if a pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum dies, and so progesterone and estrogen levels drop dramatically. If a pregnancy does occur, though, we need something to tell that corpus luteum to stay alive, keep cranking out the progesterone and the estrogen, because we've got to maintain the endometrial lining to nourish the embryo that has implanted. And so that's what this hormone does. HCG acts on the corpus luteum and stimulates it to stay alive very early in pregnancy. Now, if we look at our graph over here of HCG levels, so fertilization, now remember gestation weeks, that starts time zero of gestation is actually the beginning of the mother's last menstrual period. And so ovulation and fertilization actually take place at about 2 weeks of gestation. So if fertilization occurs, HCG levels increase very rapidly. They're going to peak at about 8 weeks gestation. So that's about 6 weeks roughly after fertilization has taken place. And then if you notice, they start to drop. And it kind of levels off at a fairly low level later in the pregnancy. So why are HCG levels dropping? Well, what happens is Once the placenta begins to develop, the placenta will produce progesterone and estrogen. So it'll be sending the signals to the endometrial lining of the uterus to stay in place and stay functional to help maintain the pregnancy. So because of that, the corpus luteum is no longer needed, and HCG levels can decline, and your corpus luteum in the ovary can go ahead and decay like it would have normally if a pregnancy had not taken place. So that's why you really only need this HCG during the early part of the pregnancy, and then later the placenta is going to take over for the corpus luteum. So we don't have to tell the corpus luteum to stay alive anymore. Okay, and then let's talk a little bit more about placentation, or the development of the placenta. And the placenta is obviously a very important organ, which is created from both tissues of the developing embryo and also the mother. All right, and so over here, here's a 7.5-day implanting blastocyst. And so right in here you have structures. Many of those structures there are going to turn into the going to turn into the embryo, and also the amniotic sac that's going to cover the embryo while it's developing. And then you have an outer area in here, which is basically digging into the endometrial lining of the uterus. So all the pink structures you see here, all the light pink, that's the endometrium in the uterus of the mother. All right, and this kind of outer red ring that you see here, this is going to be the outermost covering of the very, very early embryo that's developing. That's called the chorion. So that's not the same as the amnion, which is the clear sac that's filled with fluids that the developing embryo and the fetus will float around in while they're inside the mother. That's actually developing up here in blue. That's the really early amnion that's developing. The chorion is outward from there. And then as we continue on, here's a 16-day embryo. And here, when you see this terminology in your textbook, 16-day embryo means 16 days after conception. Gestation would be more like 30 days at this point, because we didn't have fertilization until about 2 weeks after the beginning of the last menstrual period. So by the time you have a 16-day embryo, the chorion has developed these little projections that you see in here, and those are basically digging into the endometrial lining, and you have enzymes and so forth that are degrading the parts of the endometrium and creating these cavities, these blood-filled cavities. And each of those is actually called a lacuna. Remember lacuna from back in Biology 201, where you have these little fluid-filled spaces that chondrocytes, your cartilage cells, reside in, and you also have those for your osteocytes and bone. So lacuna means like a chamber. And so along the endometrial lining, the lacuna is a blood-filled space, and it's filled with a mother's blood. So what we're developing here is thin strips of tissues from the developing embryo that are next to these blood-filled chambers that contain the mother's blood. And that's important because we want to have an exchange of gases and wastes, things like oxygen gas. The mother's blood has to bring oxygen gas to the developing embryo and fetus. So we're going to need a thin strip of tissue there across which this gas exchange can occur. Same thing with nutrients. The mother's blood has to bring in the glucose and the amino acids and the lipids and things like that that the developing embryo is going to need large amounts of for all of the development of organs and tissues that are going to be taking place very rapidly. Also, the mother's blood is going to have to carry away things like carbon dioxide and other wastes that are generated by the developing embryo and the fetus. So what we're developing here is a structure where the mother's blood and blood, eventually blood of the embryo and the fetus, will come very close to each other, but they won't actually make physical contact. That's important because a developing embryo or a fetus is, of course, not identical to the mother. It's been created through the genetic combination of the mother and the father. So the mother's immune system will actually see the embryo or the fetus as a foreign body. So you don't want the cells of an embryo or a fetus and the blood of the mother actually making physical contact with each other, because the mother's white blood cells might become activated and start attacking the developing embryo or the fetus. So it's important that we maintain that separation between the two. Okay, I think this slide is just providing a written summary of some of the things I've already talked about. Your placenta is forming from the embryonic trophoblasts and maternal endometrial tissues. And as I mentioned, the chorion, so the trophoblast, much of that is going to turn into the chorion a little bit later, and it develops those finger-like projections which will dig into the endometrial lining, create those blood-filled spaces with the mother's blood. And the chorion also becomes vascularized. That means it's going to contain blood vessels of the developing embryo and the fetus, because we're going to need that exchange between the blood of the developing embryo and fetus and the mother. And those will eventually extend to the embryo as umbilical arteries and veins. The umbilical cord is going to contain those blood vessels and connect the developing embryo and fetus to the placenta. All right, by the end of the 3rd month of pregnancy, the placenta is fully formed and functional. The placenta, as we've mentioned, is going to take over production of estrogen and progesterones. So we don't need those made by the corpus luteum in the ovary anymore. The placenta is also going to make some additional hormones. Human placental lactogen. You can probably figure out what that's going to do, like lactate. That's going to help stimulate production of milk in the mammary glands. And then there's another hormone, human chorionic thyrotropin is made by the placenta. That's not the same as gonadotropin. Thyrotropin, what is that going to act on? The thyroid. That's a hormone that acts on the thyroid, another type of endocrine gland. Which, guess what that's going to do? That's going to increase production of T3 and T4 by the thyroid. And why do you think you need increased production of T3 and T4 by the thyroid when you're pregnant? Because T3 and T4 increase metabolism. And hopefully it's not a surprise to you that you're going to need increased metabolism in a pregnant mom and her developing embryo and fetus. And there's another hormone, relaxin, which is going to help to start relaxing some of the tissues in the bony bowl of the pelvis and so forth to prepare the mother to be able to deliver the infant. All right, so early in pregnancy, if the placenta does not develop properly or it's not producing progesterone or an estrogen properly, then the pregnancy will abort, because as the HCG levels drop, as those go down, the corpus luteum in the ovary is going to die, so it's not going to make progesterone and estrogen anymore, and so a pregnancy will actually abort. A woman will have a miscarriage if the placenta does not take over properly for hormone production. And you probably know of pregnant women who have to have their progesterone levels monitored early in pregnancy, and sometimes they have to take progesterone supplements if it looks like the placenta is not kicking in and cranking out as much progesterone as it really needs to help maintain the pregnancy. And again, this is very critical as well. The mother and the embryo, their blood normally does not mix. They're not actually supposed to make physical contact, but you have a very thin separation between the two. So you may have embryo blood here, mom blood over here, and mom's blood will be located inside those blood-filled spaces in the placenta. And so this little strip right in here consists of tissues of the chorionic villi and endothelium of the embryonic capillaries. Will create that very thin barrier. It's just like what we've seen in the lungs, where we have that really thin respiratory membrane separating the air in the alveoli and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. Same thing here. Any part of the body where you've got to do absorption, gas exchange, nutrient exchange, you're going to have very thin barriers involved in separating the different fluids or spaces involved in those types of functions. All right, now when the embryo reaches 4.5 weeks, so this is 4.5 weeks after conception, you can see it looks very different. It looks more like what we think an embryo is looking like. And here in blue, this is your amnion, filled in light blue with the amniotic fluid. And then your chorion is actually out in here. So this outer covering. Then in light pink there, you do actually have a space early on between the chorion and the amnion. There's actually a space for a while. It's called the extra embryonic coelom, or coelom, right in there. And over here in yellow, this is the yolk sac, which does kind of look like a yolk in a chicken egg, but it's not providing nutrients to the developing embryo like it does in a bird egg or a reptile egg. In the case of a developing human embryo, that yolk sac is actually the source of some of the first blood cells that are created. All right, and then out in here, so in light pink, what you're seeing there, those are those chorionic villi in light pink, and in the dark red, those are those blood-filled chambers of the mother, and then those things are coming together to form the early placenta. And you can see in red and blue, those are the embryonic blood vessels, which are involved in the exchange of gases and nutrients between the blood of the embryo and the mother's blood in those little blood-filled chambers. All right, and 13 weeks after conception, we have a fetus at this point, which obviously looks very much like a tiny human. And here's the umbilical cord, which is nice and developed, extending up in here, and the placenta now would be more recognizable as a placenta at this point. And same deal there, where you have the light pink structures. Those are your chorionic villi that contain the fetal blood vessels that are doing gas exchange and nutrient exchange and waste exchange with these blood-filled compartments in dark red that are part of the mother's placenta. And the yolk sac looks kind of wimpy at this point. And notice also that the amnion, with the developing fetus on the inside, is really pressing up more against the chorion at this point. So you don't really have that big gap or space between those two structures by the time you get to that point in development. In lecture 18B, we're going to talk more about the extra embryonic membranes. There are 4 of those, so these are membranes or coverings that are outside of the developing embryo or the fetus itself, but they develop from the zygote as it divides over and over again. The genetic instructions for creating these extra embryonic membranes are part of the embryo itself. And then the germ layers, these are 3 tissue layers that develop very early after conception, and they go on to become all the different organs and tissues and structures of the body. So we'll talk a little bit about those. And also organogenesis, which means the formation of the different body systems and the organs contained within them. So we'll cover those topics in lecture 18B.